First of all, you've said something very provocative, and then you've told me I have a position. Well, the provocative thing was to draw a distinction between public opinion research on the one hand and facts on the other. And I'm not sure that distinction always applies. I think public opinion is a fact. And as far as a position goes, I'm not really, you'll have to decide whether I'm putting forward a position or not. I'd like to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be back in Georgia. I'm very grateful to NDI Georgia for inviting me. It's a tremendous delight to see so many familiar faces and old friends, and it's a great pleasure to be in Georgia itself. I left in 2009, so it won't surprise you that I'm not going to discuss Georgia. I'm going to try and discuss a few more general things. I've only chosen 6 examples to share with you because of time constraints. And the guiding principle that I applied in choosing those 6, maybe this is where I have a position, is each one of them tells us something about how research can make a difference when it comes to decision-making. I've tended to focus on decision-making rather than policy-making, because I think that citizens make decisions as well, and polling isn't just for the benefit of political leaders. I'm not going to have much time to talk about methods, but I would just say that any conversation about this which is divorced from methods isn't very helpful. But since I've learned an awful lot of what I know about methods from the speaker in the next panel, Aaron Ehrlich, I'm going to leave that side of things to him. Before getting down to the examples that I've chosen, I'd like to say just a few words about the role that facts play in decision-making. It is tempting to focus on this now. I heard on CNN this morning a spokesman to Mr. Trump refer to, quote, alternative facts, which I imagine what was meant by that was a parallel universe, but the term used was alternative facts. And so that's why I'm going to start by saying these things that don't necessarily have a direct bearing on the examples I've chosen. It is tempting to see human history, at least since the Enlightenment, as a linear process in which it has become progressively easier to establish facts and to make rational decisions based upon them. That doesn't actually work, even if, like me, you come from a place with a long, unbroken record of democratic or quasi-democratic decision-making. It works even less well if you think about Nazi Germany, Mao's China, the Soviet Union, or Putin's Russia. In extreme cases, leaders try to cut off the problem of unwelcome facts at source by controlling the research process itself. And in the case of opinion research, you can see what's happened with the Levada Center in Russia. But, and this is a more controversial thing to say, to a greater or lesser extent, all decision makers choose which facts to focus on, and they all have to decide whether they want to deal with the world as it is or not. There is usually a price to be paid for refusing to accept uncomfortable realities, but that price is not always paid by decision makers alone, and it is not always paid promptly. Resisting the temptation to operate in an imaginary world of your own choosing requires real leadership on the part of decision makers and discerning decisions on the part of citizens as well. There are some things which, in my experience, having worked for NDI in many parts of the world over a long period of time, I think there are some things that researchers can do that help decision makers to understand and deal with the world the way it is. And I've got just a few pointers. The first is for researchers to constantly question our own integrity and objectivity. Secondly, to deploy the most robust methods available so that skepticism about the results is minimized. Thirdly, to demystify the research process and help more people to understand what should and should not be trusted and why. To interpret data objectively Sometimes researchers have to reconcile themselves to uncomfortable realities as well as decision makers. And then finally, forming, if possible, a non-confrontational bridge between the views that citizens express and the decision makers who need to understand them, and those decision makers often include citizens as well. So after making a few general remarks, I'm going to offer you 6 examples in my own experience where opinion research made a real difference. The first one, if we can have the first slide, this is from Ukraine. It's from our latest survey, where fieldwork was done in November and December of last year. Margin of error is plus or minus 3. Sample size was large and complicated. And we're very grateful for our cooperation with CRRC, amongst others, for this work. Some people portray Ukraine as a divided country, and they describe the conflict as a civil war. According to this narrative, there are large swathes of territory in the south and east of the country where the aspirations of most people point eastwards towards Russia rather than westwards towards Europe. In all the research that we have done over the past 2 years, using a wide array of methods, we found these statements to be highly questionable. This slide shows that 86% of our sample say it's important, or in 35% of cases, very important to them, that Ukraine becomes a fully functioning democracy. This is an example of finding unity where people expect division, and this can matter a lot. The message in this case, to internal and external audiences alike, is that imposing an authoritarian or semi-authoritarian system on these people is unlikely to produce peace. The next example is also from Ukraine, and this is about debunking myths. Next slide. This is about debunking myths about gender. This is from a split sample experiment that we did in Kiev in 2015, which was later replicated across the country. After the elections in 2014, Ukraine was ranked 56th out of 57 OSCE countries in terms of the gender balance in its parliament. And this slide shows you a way of trying to figure out what the problem really was. Was the problem that voters will not support women candidates, or was the problem that parties wouldn't nominate them, or some other issue? In this case, we found no statistical difference whatsoever between people's willingness to vote for male and female candidates faced with the same information about both. This was a way of posing a question about gender without the respondents knowing that gender was the issue. The third one is from Kenya. This is about measuring fear. This helped to improve, or I should just say with the Ukrainian case on gender, that helped to improve decision-making by making it easier for people to raise the prospect of quotas in elections for gender. In the Kenyan case, this is about measuring fear. How likely did people feel that they would be victims of politically motivated violence along tribal lines in the period leading up to a very contentious election? And it proved to be very useful to measure this fear. On several occasions, we found high levels of fear in areas where the people most interested in humanitarian assistance and others were least expecting it. And this was immediately before the election, where we saw a high level of fear in Western Kenya, and humanitarian materials were provided there before the election, and it was one of the few places where violence did actually break out, and there was a need to respond. Another one from Kenya, also around those elections in 2013, is about the importance of knowing what people don't know. This was very important in policy terms, because only 2 months before the election, 87% of people expected to vote electronically, and in fact, they were never going to vote electronically. And this gave the Election Commission time to explain more clearly to voters how they were going to vote, so that they would not turn up in polling stations expecting to vote electronically, which they trusted, and being faced with pencil and paper, which they didn't. I've only got 2 left. One more from Kenya. Next slide. Yes, this is it. This is a proxy question. There was some discussion this morning about an excessive focus on horse races. I can't emphasize enough how much I hate the focus on horse races or horse race numbers in polls, and how harmful that can be In this case, immediately before an election where the whole country could have been pitched into something akin to civil war, I did not want to ask a question about how people were going to vote. Most of the polls said that Mr. Odinga, the then Prime Minister, would win, but not in the first round. In fact, every poll gave some version of that story. Instead of asking how people were going to vote, we asked this question. The two candidates, presidential and vice presidential candidate opposing Mr. Odinga, were both indicted at The Hague for crimes against humanity. So we asked, should they be entitled to stand? And I remember saying at the time when we saw this result, that if everybody who thought that Uhuru should be entitled to stand voted for him, he would not only win, but he could win in the first round. That was considered a very shocking story at the time, but in fact, that's exactly what happened. And this number for him is within 0.8% of the actual result. And then lastly, this is a picture from Nigeria. And this is about how lessons learned in one place can help in other places, and how an evidence-based approach to programming can be very helpful in saving lives. Not only was large-scale conflict avoided in Kenya, and this research was part of that story, only part of it, but an important part, but that also helped to avoid violence in Nigeria a few years later. This is a very important Nigerian rap star delivering a rap about vote, not fight, in front of a word cloud. You can see the fingerprint of NDI there. And this was based entirely on the understandings that we had achieved through research in Kenya about conflict mitigation. I do hope that's helpful.